When someone confronts one of us with something that they maybe believe that we did wrong, maybe it was something we did or said that might have caused insult or injury in some manner, we tend to respond in one of three ways. First, we can just lie about our involvement. Or second, we could argue to try and justify ourselves. Or third, lastly, we could simply own up to our actions. The first way that we tend to respond is this way of lying. We outright lie, or maybe we kind of tell half-truths. We didn't do or say whatever we're being told that we did. Things happen maybe in a different manner. That's at least what we would say, or they didn't happen at all. And maybe we do this because we don't want to get in trouble. Maybe we do this because we don't want others to not think well of us. And this could happen even if there was nothing really wrong with what we might have done. We just don't want to deal with the fallout of our actions, so we will lie to kind of cover them up or soften what we might have actually been doing or saying. Many years ago, I worked for Knowles Atomic Power Laboratory here in Milton, and I was in the operations section, and I worked alongside with many of the Navy to operate power plants there. And as you might imagine, that is an intensely scrutinized process. You don't mess around with operating power plants, and things would happen though. And people are people. People make mistakes. And sometimes those mistakes could be big, sometimes they could be small. And the danger was always that those consequences for those mistakes could be very severe. And they tended to be severe, not necessarily from a life and safety standpoint, but they tended to be severe from a personnel response standpoint, because the idea was to make sure that things never escalated to a life and safety problem. So, for example, if somebody made a mistake and what they were trying to do was actually to lock out some equipment, to de-energize some electrical equipment so it could get worked on, they call that process tagging out the equipment. They open the breakers, they hang tags on them to just make sure that everything has been fully de-energized so that the person who's going to go in there and work on the equipment does not get electrocuted. But some of those systems can be very complex, and sometimes people who are trying to figure out where they should actually hang tags, they might miss one. Or maybe a tag gets mislabeled and doesn't get put in the right spot, or something can get hung on the wrong breaker, and the wrong breaker doesn't get opened. Or the wrong breaker gets open and the right breaker doesn't get open. So the equipment basically remains energized. There's still power going through that unit, even though it's supposed to be fully shut down. Now, if the proper safety procedures were being followed, then the person is going to realize this before they ever go in and actually work on the equipment. So they shouldn't ever be in any real danger. Now, in the rest of the world, most of the world, a mistake like that would simply involve stopping the work and then going back and figuring out what was wrong, fixing it, and then continuing back with whatever work needed to be done. But in the Navy, it typically involves a very formal and public review, training, and often disciplinary measures in addition to that. And the idea is that this helps ensure, and I would add it successfully does this, that people don't get hurt and things don't get damaged. But the consequences of negligence or even a simple mistake, at least in a personnel response standpoint, the consequences were and are severe. And unfortunately, from time to time, there would be somebody who, not wanting to get in trouble for something that they may have been a part of, some sort of problem, they would lie about it. They would sort of cover it up so that they wouldn't have to face the wrath of the system. Now, that's not representative of the Navy by any means, and I would honestly trust the Navy to operate a power plant before really I would trust probably any other government or private entity, including private commercial power companies. The Navy has a tremendously good track record because of the vigilance that they do with regard to their operations. But people still lie to avoid consequences or trouble or simply to preserve their reputations, and that can happen in the Navy or really in any other setting, any other context. And this is really what brings us to the first part of our text for today, because as we are looking at Jesus' questioning as part of his trial, Jesus is accused of many different things. And I think we can learn a lot from his response to these interrogations. Now, a few weeks ago, we read about Jesus being arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane. And last week, we read about how Peter was questioned about his relationship to Jesus. And we heard a little bit about that in the children's message this morning as well, how Peter denied ever knowing Jesus 3 times. Peter didn't want to get in trouble. He was going through this crisis of faith, so he lied about ever knowing Jesus. But Peter's response was very different from that response that we see that Jesus had when Jesus was questioned. So let's begin this morning looking at John 18 in verse 19. I encourage you to open your Bibles so you can kind of take a look at that for yourself. John 18, verse 19. It says, "The high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching." So the high priest and the religious leaders, who, if you remember, were not at all fans of Jesus. They questioned Jesus. And they were looking for some way to legally have Jesus executed. And one way for them to do this would be to find evidence that Jesus had actually blasphemed God, or in some other way had taught people to not follow the one true God. So this was the type of stuff that they were looking for in things that Jesus might have said and taught. But Jesus, of course, had not blasphemed God. He had nothing to hide. He had no secrets. And we read him responding this way in John 18, verse 20 and 21. Starting in verse 20, it says, "Jesus answered, 'I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in the synagogues and in the temple, where all Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard what I said to them. They know what I've said.'" So everything that Jesus had said and believed, he had stated openly, publicly. And he invited the religious leaders who were questioning him to investigate really what was available for everybody to know. But in Matthew's account of Jesus' questioning, we read this in Matthew 26, starting in verse 62. It says, "The high priest stood up and said, 'Have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you?' But Jesus remained silent, and the high priest said to him, 'I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God.'" So what was going on here is that many of the witnesses who were called to testify against Jesus were actually lying about what Jesus had said and what he had done. And, they were here part of the trial process, but the religious leaders were getting frustrated because it was becoming very evident that these men were all lying because their accounts were all contradicting each other. So eventually the high priest, kind of giving up on some of this, went and asked Jesus directly. And he basically compelled him by God to tell them what he had to say for himself. Now, up to this point, Jesus had remained silent before his accusers. And there were 3 reasons that Jesus remained silent throughout much of this process, much of this trial. The first reason is actually pretty simple, and it's just that in Jewish legal proceedings, the accused person was never supposed to speak. They were never supposed to say anything anyway. Now, in our legal system, a person who's accused might take the stand and defend themselves. They don't have to, but they might do that. But in the Jewish legal system, there's no such thing. And in fact, it didn't matter what the accused said. Even if an accused person just blurted out that they were guilty, those statements were not allowed to be used against them in the Jewish court of law. So Jesus didn't speak, first off, because he wasn't supposed to speak. And the high priest here directly asking Jesus a question was actually totally out of order. He wasn't supposed to be doing that. And the fact that later on, Jesus' sentence in his trial, which we'll see in just a little bit, His sentence was ultimately decided because of what Jesus said, Jesus' own testimony. And this really shows that this whole trial that Jesus was going through, all this questioning, really was a mockery of what the Jewish legal system was supposed to be. But Jesus remained silent because for another reason as well. And this is because the religious leaders honestly were not that interested in anything that Jesus had to say other than to just use his words against him. And if you think about it, there's really no point in having a conversation with somebody, answering someone's questions who really have no interest in what your answer is anyway, when all they want to do is just manipulate their words and use them against you. They don't want to have an open mind to maybe actually consider what your argument might be. So in this case, again, Jesus remained silent. And it wasn't until they compelled him, the high priest compelled him by God to respond, Jesus didn't respond. And then the last reason that Jesus did not speak is because this was actually prophesied about Jesus himself. In 1 Peter 22, Peter quotes Isaiah 53:9 as he describes this questioning by Jesus. And it says in 1 Peter 2:22, he, meaning Jesus, committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. So first off, Jesus didn't lie. When he spoke only the truth. But a few verses earlier in Isaiah 53:7, which is also talking about Jesus, it says this: he was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth, like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. So when it came to his own defense, Jesus remained silent. This is what was prophesied about. And he only responded when he was compelled to plainly say who he was. And we read this response of Jesus in Matthew 26 in verse 64. Jesus said to him, and this again is in response to being asked who he is. The high priest is demanding an answer. Jesus said to him, "You have said so, but I tell you, from now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his robes and said, "He has uttered blasphemy. What further witnesses do we need? You have now heard his blasphemy." So in response to this question that the high priest had, if he was indeed the Messiah, Jesus quoted from the book of Daniel that actually spoke about the Messiah as being a divine individual. And at this, the high priest immediately declared blasphemy, because this was the evidence, this was the type of statement from Jesus that he was looking for so that he could have Jesus executed. You see, Jesus didn't have anything to hide. But even though he didn't have things to hide, there were some things that he taught that really did not sit well with the religious leaders. And for example, one of them was that Jesus was the Messiah. That is what Jesus taught. But they didn't believe that he was the Messiah. And they also didn't believe that Jesus was divine, as of course Jesus knew. And Jesus had the option here. He could have kind of tiptoed around those contentious points. He could have not mentioned them, or he could have softened them up a little bit with some half-truths. But that's not what he did. He didn't lie, and he didn't tell half-truths. When someone confronts one of us about something that we may have done or said, regardless of whether or not that thing is actually true, one of our responses does tend to be that we will lie. I mean, how many of us, if we were confronted with a similar situation where our own lives were on the line, how many of us might choose to lie in that situation? For that matter, how many of us might lie just simply to avoid a ticket or a fine? But not so with Jesus. Now, the second way that we tend to respond when somebody accuses us of something is that we will justify ourselves to the nth degree about what exactly we did. We don't want to be wrong, or we don't want somebody to think that we were wrong, so we will go about proving and sometimes arguing why we are actually completely right. And regardless of whether or not we were actually wrong, or maybe we weren't wrong at all, our aggressive response a lot of times in these situations reveals that really what is happening to us is that our pride is kind of being pricked. Our character has been slighted. Our ideologies have been insulted. And our pride demands vindication and justice. And our thought is that the other person or people who have slighted us must be convincingly corrected. I recall a conversation that I had with several people, this was many years back, where one of them was using somebody else's password with their permission. They were using their password to use some streaming service to watch some movies. And I don't remember what the service was exactly, but in the conversation, it was brought up how them doing that was actually stealing because they weren't paying for the service themselves. And in response, the person who was doing that just sort of dug in their heels and argued vehemently how it was not stealing to use somebody else's account because they had permission from the other person. And no matter how much it was pointed out to them that by doing that, if they were to actually ask the company that they were using the service of, if they asked them if it was okay, that they clearly wouldn't say that doing that was okay, this person would not accept that using somebody else's password was stealing. And, they responded because their character had been slighted. Their pride had been pricked, and rather than admit that they were wrong, they entrenched themselves in self-justification. So the second way that we can tend to respond is we will justify ourselves because our pride has been slighted in some manner. In John 18:22, right after Jesus told the high priest that he should ask for witnesses, the high priest should ask for witnesses to tell the religious leaders of everything that Jesus had taught, which is basically Jesus' way of redirecting the trial back to its proper course, since again, in the Jewish legal system, he was not supposed to be giving his own testimony, only the testimony of others was to be considered. But the religious leaders, in response to Jesus' statement, it was violence. That was their response. And it says in John 18, starting in verse 22, when Jesus had said these things, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus with his hand, saying, "Is that how you answer the high priest?" Jesus answered, "If what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me?" Annas then sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. So to correct the high priest, or to sort of point out that the trial was being conducted in an improper manner, was, I'm sure, embarrassing and probably a little bit insulting to the religious leaders. So they struck Jesus in response. But then we see Jesus' response in verse 23. Jesus didn't yell an insult. He didn't really do much even to try and justify why he said what he had said. He simply, and actually I think rather humbly, challenged them about their justification for doing what they were doing. And again, speaking about this incident, Peter said this in 1 Peter 2:23. It says, "When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly." When someone confronts one of us about something that we may have done or said, again, regardless of what they are saying is actually true about what really happened, one of our responses tends to be to justify ourselves and justify ourselves to exhaustion. How many of us have continued to defend the indefensible simply because to admit we were wrong would be embarrassing to us, or make us look like our ideology was weak or injure our pride? But not so with Jesus. Jesus was confident in the reasons for why he was doing what he was doing, and he felt no need to justify himself to a group of people who honestly did not care why he was doing what he was doing anyway, and regardless of what he might have said. So when confronted by our accusers, our responses tend to be either to lie about our involvement or to justify ourselves in our position. But Jesus' response is different. And this is really the third way that somebody can respond to their accuser. And that is to own up to what they're being accused of doing, to own up to being accused of what they're doing. Now, Jesus was in the right, of course, but even in the face of death, he didn't tell half-truths. He didn't try to soften his past statements. He didn't try and get in a lengthy argument trying to justify his way out of things. In 1 Peter 2:21, which is part of what we've already read from 1 Peter, we can read this whole passage where Peter is talking again about Jesus' trial. It says this, "For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, so that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly." The way that Jesus responded before his accusers really is an example to all of us, so that we ultimately might follow in his footsteps. It is a response without sin, without lying, without insult, and without threatening. And even though Peter doesn't specifically mention it in this passage, it is a response without mindless justification of our reasons for doing what we might have done. Rather, Jesus simply owned up to what was true. So Jesus' example here, we can see, is owning up to his actions. This is actually important to us in two different ways. It's applicable for us in two different ways. The first way it's applicable is if we are actually in the right. So we're actually in the right. Our accusers have no real case against us, but are accusing us anyway, just like they were doing with Jesus. Even though there was no real case against Jesus, still, in his example, he did not sin, he did not lie, he did not insult, he did not threaten, and he only offered this very brief defense and simple justification when he was being compelled to do so by the high priest. So it's not like he just rolled over and played dead, but even when the truth was misinterpreted and ignored, he did not belittle himself to sin or try and run away from the consequences. So that's the first way that this is applicable to us, is in the event that we're actually completely in the right. We can follow Jesus' example, just like Jesus was completely in the right. But the second way that Jesus' example is applicable to us is if we're actually in the wrong, if our accusers have a real case against us, and whatever they are saying is actually true in what we might have done wrong. So this case would not be like Jesus from our example. However, his example is still applicable to us. Because still, even if we were wrong, we're not to sin, we're not to lie, we're not to insult or threaten, and we're definitely not to justify ourselves in our wrongdoing. To sin is wrong, but to deny that sin ever happened or to lie about it having happened is really to stand in opposition to repentance itself. And by doing this, we are moving from being potentially repentant sinners to being unrepentant sinners. And it's very dangerous for us to be unrepentant sinners because God has very little patience for someone who has no interest in turning from their sin. So we must not lie about or excuse our sin. Rather, we need to embrace our failure, embrace what we have sinned, how we have sinned, and ultimately move back towards God. So as we have done for the last several weeks here, I have some questions, some drive-home discussion questions, and the idea of this is for you to talk about some of these things with your family on your way back home this afternoon. So 3 questions to consider with regard to this sermon. And feel free after the sermon to come up and take a picture of the screen if you'd like. The first question, what is different between how Peter and Jesus responded to their accusers? And that's directly out of our passage from today. The second question, what is a situation where you have been tempted to lie about or over-justify your actions, even if there is nothing wrong with what you may have done? And an example of this might be how someone might be tempted to lie about how they voted because of what their friends might think about them. So that's question number 2. Question number 3, how can a Christian avoid lying about or justifying their actions when they have done something wrong? So three questions for today. Please join me in prayer.